Hi there. I hope you're well this week. Before we begin again with Wright, let's review. Our module thesis this time is Wright connects Jesus' resurrection and the redemption of creation to God's mission in the world. In this video, you'll have 4 goals. You can see them on the slide. First, you'll evaluate Wright's claims about Jesus as the once and future judge of humankind in Chapter 9. Second, you'll examine his claims about the resurrection of the body in Chapter 10. Third, you will review his assessment of various views of the afterlife, purgatory, paradise, and hell in Chapter 11. And fourth and finally, you'll interpret his assertions about salvation in Chapter 12, ending at a particular spot that I'll show you. First then, we've just left Wright redefining the significant eschatological term parousia as royal presence, which is its literal interpretation, in Chapter 8. And he moves from that definition into his very brief 9th chapter, where he argues that Jesus will return to the earth as judge. Wright observes both that, quote, the word judgment carries overtones for a good many people in our liberal and post-liberal world, and that Jesus' judgment is a good thing that believers ought to celebrate because Jesus' justice is, as we've discussed before, solidarity with and equity for people who are oppressed. Wright asserts that some Old Testament passages offer evidence of God's justice, part of the effect of which is the humbling of what he calls the oppressive regimes of the pagan world. In particular, Daniel 7 portrays one like a son of man up against what Wright calls huge powerful monsters that symbolize the Gentile nations like Persia and Greece and Rome. Wright then claims that the New Testament passages validate the Old Testament passages because Jesus' task as righteous judge fulfills Isaiah 11, some of the Psalms, and other passages. Indeed, Christians may have initially begun to believe in Jesus as judge precisely because they believed in him as Messiah. Moreover, Wright uses Paul's writings to clarify that justification by faith occurs in the present time, anticipating the future day when God judges the world. That is, justification by faith and future judgment according to works, quote, actually need and depend upon one another, end quote. I entirely affirm that claim of Wright's because people who really live into their justification by faith will welcome the future assessment of the things they've done based on that faith. But that's an awfully big claim to simply state and then leave aside for most of the rest of the text. I just wanted to flag that. Wright affirms that Jesus' second coming is an essential part of the Christian message insofar as the Lord, quote, confronts the world in the present and will do so personally and visibly in the future, end quote. Moreover, that confrontation will necessitate transformation, as before. And in addition, Wright asserts both that Jesus' transformative return as judge will put paid to Hindu and Buddhist accounts of reincarnation, and that Jesus' return as judge makes our political work, us Christians, better than it would be without Jesus. So as an inclusivist, as one who believes that Jesus is not the only way to God, I want to assert that Wright is probably incorrect in the first case, and that he makes far too strong a case in the second. That said, we know that Jesus' transformative return as judge will definitely animate the political and other kinds of work that we do in the world. Second big idea, Chapter 10. Wright uses a particularly Pauline framework to argue that the bodily resurrection is an instrumental part of the Christian hope. He proclaims that Romans 8:23 serves as a programmatic passage that describes a new kind of bodily life, which he calls the fulfillment and redemption of our present bodily life. Furthermore, Wright asserts that theologians need to, quote, talk with biblical precision about the resurrection, end quote. According to Wright's rereading of Romans 8, God will give new life through the Spirit to the mortal bodies of all believers. Most significantly, Wright interprets Paul's claims about resurrection in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5 to mean that human bodies will attain, quote, a new mode of physicality, much more real, much more firmed up, much more bodily than our present body, end quote. Could be a bit like Mr. Jackman on the slide there, as Wolverine, very firm, very bodily. In any case, you'll notice that Wright's point about resurrection is both cogent and strident. As many other theologians, notably Barth, make clear elsewhere, Wright affirms that the newly risen bodies of Jesus' friends will be transformed into the substance of God's desire, and that will attain a form of incorruptible physicality. So, again, like Wolverine, we will not be susceptible to harm. Kinda cool. Later, after surveying the tradition for affirmation of his argument, Wright contends that the newly risen body of every friend of Jesus will be immortal, and that human beings will be given new bodies primarily so that we can rule wisely over God's new world. I wonder if Wright would benefit from reading Tinker's argument about eschatology as a spatial metaphor, because Tinker's argument isn't about rule at all. It's about maintenance, basically. Third goal. Wright assesses various views of the afterlife, purgatory, paradise, and hell. You can see hell on the slide. He basically claims that none of the views he's talking about are right, and instead asserts his own rightness. First, Wright argues against purgatory, which he says is basically a Roman Catholic doctrine. According to Wright's schema, there are no distinctions in terms of unfinished earthly business for believers, so purgatory cannot exist for Christians. Furthermore, writing of paradise, in light of Romans 8, Wright asserts that, quote, all the Christian departed are in substantially the same state, that of restful happiness, end quote. He also states, kind of nicely, that we who believe in Christ ought to continue to pray for our departed loved ones in that spirit of love, even if there isn't any biblical evidence that they can affect our time here on earth. Finally, Wright asserts in terms of hell, both that it is on earth, not elsewhere, that human actions matter, and that Jesus' brief allusions to hell in the Gospels are metaphors and parables, not actual descriptions. Quick note. Let me be clear. I do not like chapter 11 of Wright's book, as most of his argument in that chapter hinges on once having read everything he's read about the afterlife and then agreeing with his view. And I haven't, and I don't, so Wright's view appears to me to be a very incoherent argument. There are far clearer and rather more polite ways of saying what Wright is saying here about heaven and purgatory and hell. Thus, in your longer papers, as you so desire, you are most welcome to find those ways and write out those arguments. Fourth, and blessedly, Wright's 12th chapter contains a much clearer account of salvation than his 11th does of the afterlife. He states cogently, as you can read, that Jesus' bodily resurrection, quote, marks a watershed, end quote, in terms of God's ultimate purpose for earthly life. That is, the future hope of resurrection empowers human participation in God's mission in the present day, which I think is really exciting, don't you? Wright argues that salvation is not going to heaven, quote, but being raised to life in God's new heaven and new earth. Moreover, Wright argues quite rightly that the risen Jesus and the Spirit given to us by God's grace are both designed to make human beings, quote, agents of the transformation of the earth, a transformation already begun in Jesus the Christ, which is cool, no? According to Wright, as well as Frisk and Cohn and others, we are raised from death, precisely to help God in the renewal of the world. I think that's wicked cool. And that is a positive note on which to pause and take stock of what we've just interpreted in terms of Wright. Again, our module thesis this time is, Wright connects Jesus' resurrection and the redemption of creation to God's mission in the world. In this video, you've clarified that thesis in 4 small but significant ways. First, you've evaluated Wright's claims about Jesus as the once and future judge of humankind. Second, you've examined his claims about the resurrection of the body. Third, you've reviewed his assessment of various views of the afterlife rather quickly. And fourth and finally, you've interpreted his assertions about salvation in chapter 12, ending on the note that Jesus' resurrection is in fact the prologue to the resurrection of all of Jesus' friends, who will then work as co-creators of a sort with God to recreate and renew the world. That's enough of Wright for now. When you're ready, please go on to the next video. Thank you.